If it's not obvious by now, my flute is finished. Since last time we spoke, I've added these white nylon bindings which are intended to prevent the flute from splitting. We've also painted it with a water-based acrylic enamel, on the inside red and on the outside clear. Mr. Pepper was kind enough to teach us how to tie these white nylon bindings onto our flute. Essentially, you start by making a loop and wrapping the cord around the loop. With the side of the rope that you started winding from, you pull the loop, which is now threaded on the other side, underneath the cord that you've wrapped around the flute. Now, you've just tied a knot underneath the wound area. All you have to do is tighten it with some pliers, dab a little bit of runny crazy glue, or super glue as you might call it, because it will seep into there and bind the knot to prevent it from slipping. And then with a sharp knife, trim the edges of the exposed rope, and you'll have beautiful finished knots. As you'll see, there's a slight bump where the knot is underneath, but it's generally imperceptible. Now, the binding is supposed to stop it from splitting, and I attribute this to using water-based acrylic. As you remember, our bamboo was dried, and whenever you add moisture to something that's dry, you change its density. And so, as I was lacquering the inside of my flute with red, I got a nice big split right down the middle of my flute. And you might not be able to see it in the video, but here it is. Rather ugly and displeasing split, which has run actually surprisingly far along my flute. Because I had just painted the inside red and I hadn't painted the outside yet, I used some crazy glue to pour it into the crack in an attempt to seal it, and then I sanded it and finished the outside. Rather than water-based acrylic bindings that don't stop it from splitting. To paint the flutes, we began by taping up the holes on the flute using green frog tape, as it's called. You can use frog tape with acrylic-based paints, but you can't use it with oil-based paints. What the frog tape does is it makes a seal around the areas that you're trying to keep the paint out of. Once all the holes were sealed up, we thinned our red water-based acrylic with a 1:4 ratio of thinner to paint. Then we poured the red paint into it and turned it around, and after we had felt like, okay, it's coated, we turned it upside down on a slight angle and allowed it to drip out the end while rotating. Once it had dripped, we took our lint-free cloth on a coat hanger and put it in, turned it around and pulled it out, and just sort of did a back and forth motion like this, trying to make sure that, just as when you're coating a frying pan with oil, that the entire inside was coated with red paint. Once we did that, we poured the red in again one more time, let it drip out, and put the rod in to smooth out the surface. There was a bit of a happy accident here on the end where the paint actually seeped through and saturated this rope. I didn't mean for that to happen, but because I had this split, I needed to super glue that and sand down the super glue anyway. So while I was doing that, I sanded down any bits of red glop that got stuck on the outside. And this looked great, keeping it red, so I just sanded down the area on the very tip and left the rope red, and it's a nice little accent. Once the inside was coated red, we gently wrapped a thin brass wire around the tip to hold it up and tied it to a ladder so that it would hang suspended and dry out. I was also able to make a stopper for the bottom of my flute out of wax. Here I've got little flecks of beeswax which I have placed in a aluminum foil funnel and heated up under a broiler. And here I'm going to attempt to pour this hot molten wax into my flute. Ah! Okay, that filled up fast. Was not expecting it to come out that fast, folks. The first try was a bit rough, but after several other attempts I was able to get a nice leveled off top. The end of my flute now has wax in it all the way from here to here, and I put a light layer of wax over the areas where I have little cracks, and that seems to have solved the overblowing issues. And miraculously, I was able to start playing in the upper register. I wasn't able to play in the upper register before attempting this. Well folks, that concludes my adventure making a shinobuoi. To reflect on this experience, the biggest lesson I've learned is that a first attempt is never perfect. There are so many things that I've done during this project that I've done over, or that I know that I would have to do differently if I did this whole project over again. I would say the big three that I would do differently next time, and I do want to do it again, is, for one, I would not leave this note intact. I would hollow out both sides and make sure that there was a bit of a taper, larger on this side, smaller on this side. I would sand the whole surface of the bamboo smooth before drilling any holes. I kind of waited till after I drilled holes to do it on this flute, and there were a few times where I splintered off a piece of bamboo in the process. I would then, once it was all smoothed and hollowed and the bamboo is just an empty tube, I would stencil on the holes so that I could make them the exact size and the exact position on the bamboo to match my schematic. Then, once I had made the holes, I would cover all the holes and insert a cork into this end and adjust the position of the cork and the length on this end until it was tuned to a perfect A440, because that's what the tsutsune pitch on this flute is supposed to be. Once I have the tsutsune pitch tuned, I would gradually work my way up the scale, try like 5 times in a row to play a note with an electric tuner, and if it's out of tune, I would just adjust the size of the hole ever so slightly to try to see if I can push it into tune, and if I can't, then it's just the way that it is. That way I would have a lot of control over the actual tuning of the instrument. The way that I did it this time, I had no control over tuning. I tried to follow the schematic, I didn't follow it totally right, and there was no way for me to adjust because I couldn't have this wax in there until after I had finished painting the whole thing, and then once it's painted you don't be sanding and cutting it. It's just not efficient. Then finally, I would probably bind with the actual rattan or another reed, because that's really what they would traditionally use, and that's what the makers today use. And they use a wood glue of some sort to actually glue it in place. That would, I think, give me more protection against splitting than the rope did. Because even though the rope was pulled really, really tight, this still managed to split, which means that there wasn't enough tension. And so I think with the reed, when applied with glue, I think that would allow for the bamboo fibers to actually be kind of locked into one spot, and they wouldn't even be able to budge from side to side. And when I paint, I would put very thin coats and use some kind of oil-based paint, possibly a lacquer, possibly a very strong enamel like you might use for a barbecue or something like that. That's what Mr. Pepper actually recommended we use because it's very tough and it would be very water resistant and heat tolerant. And had we used something like that, I think that our flutes would have a greater longevity, but we were in a hurry, so we had to pick a fast drying paint. You can't rush something like this. We kind of had to delay our process because, you know, our informants could only meet with us at certain times, and then by the time we were able to actually start building, we were very, very crunched for time. We had to rush. If I were to make this again, I wouldn't rush. I would allow like full day in between coats. And if I had not rushed the finishing process, I wouldn't have oversaturated the wood and I would not have split it. And I would have glued the rattan bamboo binding, and that would have prevented splitting as well. Knowing what I know now, I think that my next shinobuoi flute is going to be 100 times better than this one, and this one is already pretty sweet. Now that I've made the flute, it's going to be quite a frantic run to the finish line to learn to play it. I can I'm starting to get a little more consistent. I can almost always play me in the low register, but it's still hard for me to pick off the low tonic. There it is. So it's going to be a bit of a learning experience to get that low register to work. And I think in the upper register, because my instrument's not quite perfectly in tune, I'm going to have to start using I'm going to have to experiment with some altering fingerings to get the really high notes in tune. Yeah, and just to get that high register consistent, that's going to take a lot of practice. Thank you for watching. This has been a great experience, and I'm glad I've been able to share it to you through YouTube. So I hope that you all have the best of luck in your own endeavors if you choose to make your own flute. And if you're not going to make a flute, I hope that this has at least been fun to watch.